When we moved to this amazing spot in the Upper Severn Valley 27 years ago, we always wanted to have ponds in our garden.
Build a pond and the wildlife will come,
We were told, and as we love wildlife and wanted to do all we could to encourage it on our patch, we couldn't wait to find out.
This video tells the story of how we built not one but 2 ponds for our garden near Llanidloes in mid Wales and what happened next.
The first pond we built was a small garden pond on one of our gravel garden terraces in front of the house. It was the first pond we had ever built anywhere, so we decided to start small and see what happened.
The pond was built in 2001 as part of the complete makeover of what we call our front garden. This garden is overlooked not by a road but by our house and drops away quite steeply from the property towards the River Severn.
When we arrived, there were a few tumble-down concrete block walls in a rectangular fashion holding up 2 scrappy lawn areas, covered in rubbish at the time. We decided to landscape this area with curving dry stone walls and a gravel garden. The second terrace looked like the perfect spot for our first pond.
The overall dimensions of the pond were pretty much determined by the space of this terrace. We wanted a path and a garden bed to run alongside the pond, plus a spot for a garden seat. Before we started digging, however, we did loads of research into other aspects such as shape and depth, which materials to use to make our pond, and the recommended plants for a pond this size.
We built the pond over a period of several weeks, tucking it into the base of the new dry stone wall we had just stacked. It is kidney-shaped, 10.5 feet long by 5.5 feet wide and about 2.5 feet deep at the maximum point, with a shallow shelf all the way around the edge.
Once we had levelled out the base, we put in a layer of sand to protect the pond liner from any sharp stones in the soil. A pond underlay followed, and then the actual flexible liner. We filled up the pond with lovely fresh water from the natural spring on our land.
To make sure that the pond sat well in the new garden area, we held the liner in place all round the top of the pond with flat quarried stones made from the same local rock as our new dry stone walls.
We planted up the pond with irises, water forget-me-not, purple loosestrife, water lilies and various other water-loving and oxygenating plants. We went a bit overboard in our inexperience and early enthusiasm, as we were so late to find out.
The plants were potted up in a pond compost in special pond plant baskets and placed either on the shelf or, in the case of the water lilies, on a small platform of bricks in the centre of the pond.
And this is what the pond looked like by then.
The most amazing thing is just how quickly the wildlife moved in. Within weeks we had pond skaters, water beetles, boatmen and snails, and before long the first frogs were spotted.
We decided not to introduce fish, as we thought that they would eat some of the other water creatures and provide expensive food for the passing herons.
Ever since, this small pond has been bustling with wildlife. We especially enjoy watching fully grown dragonflies emerging from the larvae which have climbed up from the water onto the taller pond plants. There they turn into their final flying form, dry off in the sun and fly off to find a mate.
Garden birds also soon found the pond, the perfect place to drink, even though we already had a bird bath.
We were thrilled with our new pond and before long had ambitions for a much larger one elsewhere in the garden.
Living on a hill presents all kind of challenges to pond lovers. We finally settled on a gently sloping site in front of our recently constructed compost toilet shed. As this was a much bigger project, we persuaded the builders working on our small house extension to excavate the hole with their diggers.
This pond, which we built in July 2007, is about 44 feet long by 23 feet wide at the widest point, is oval and curves gently to a narrower western end. As the site slopes, we built up the hill on the long southern edge of the pond. This side drops quite steeply down the hill. On the other side of the pond sits a rough lawn which is full of snowdrops and crocuses in early spring and wildflowers in the summer.
Once the hole was roughly excavated, we did further work by hand to smooth off some edges. Again, we had created a deeper area in the centre of the pond, about 4 feet deep, and a shallow slope rather than a shelf all the way around the edge to enable wildlife to get in and out easily.
Friends helped us lay the pond underlay and liner. It was a massive task. The liner on its own was extremely heavy and we had to roll it to the site to lay out and pull into place.
We wanted the pond to look as natural as possible, and so then added a third layer of synthetic material to cover the liner. Bit by bit, this third layer, which we held down with of bricks to start with was covered in infertile soil and then water added slowly from our spring to top up the pond. It was a long but exciting process and well worth the effort for the final effect.
At the eastern end of the pond, we dug a shallow bog area into which the main pond water could overflow in times of heavy rain. This gave us the opportunity to introduce different plants into the area. A section of liner went down here too, but we punctured the base with a few holes to allow slow drainage.
Once the pond had been filled, again using water from our natural spring, we dug a trench around the circumference and carefully buried the edges of our 3 layers of underlay and liner. This was then covered with further soil to completely disguise any synthetic materials.
At which point we stood back to admire our new pond.
We used similar plants to plant up this big pond, but instead of using baskets, we planted directly into the soil. We were able to transplant some irises and purple loosestrife from our small pond, which needed clearing out regularly anyway, and friends gave us other plants from their own overgrown ponds. Bog bean, water soldiers and water forget-me-not soon found their way in, along with some oxygenators. We planted candelabra primulas along the edges of the pond at each end.
At the eastern end, alongside the bog area, we placed about 20 large river rocks so that frogs, toads and other creatures could make their way to and from the pond with shelter en route.
For a couple of years the new pond looked a bit bare, but the introduced plants soon grew large enough to soften the hard edges. We also allowed wildflowers such as St John's wort and common knapweed to grow tall along the lawn side, cutting down just a small area to give a better view of pond creatures. Before long the pond looked as if it had always been there. We were very pleased, especially after all our efforts.
Over the years, we have grown to know the pond wildlife more intimately in this large pond, as we actually have to get into it to weed out overgrown areas. With water on tap, plants grow incredibly quickly and have to be kept under control unless we want one enormous bog in the garden.
When weeding, we lay plant matter onto sheets of black plastic next to the pond so that water and any creatures can find their way back using the gentle slope to help progress. We find water snails, dragon and damselfly larvae, water boatmen and all kinds of wriggly creatures.
Our favourites are the newts, which swim so delicately through the water, and every February the garden echoes to the loud croaking of armies of frogs which appear to spawn here.
Herons visit occasionally. They don't find any fish as there are none, but no doubt enjoy filling up on tasty frogs, frog spawn, worms and other small creatures they come across.
Ducks also drop by now and again, but we haven't encouraged them as duck ponds seem to end up very muddy and messy places, lacking in other wildlife.
We enjoy watching the pond through the changing seasons each year.
Spring. It's actually late February when the frogs return en masse to the big pond, but it always feels as if spring has arrived when the loud croaking starts up again for the year.
Masses of frog spawn soon starts to appear in big clumps around the base of pond plants. And then, business done, the frogs head off back to the undergrowth for shelter.
As the weeks progress, the spawn miraculously transforms into small, wriggly tadpoles and eventually into baby froglets, although they are incredibly hard to spot by this point.
Other pond life also returns, including pond skaters and water boatmen, and our beloved newts and toads.
Spring sees the first growth of plants in the pond and also around it. Crocus carpets the ground near the big pond, again usually flowering late in February and early March.
The native yellow flag iris thrives in the pond margins, along with other aquatic irises gifted to us over the years. Native marsh marigolds love the bog garden, and there is a white version in the small pond.
Nearby trees, such as flowering cherries and rowans, along with native hawthorns and willows, are soon full of flowers and foliage. They provide the perfect places for nesting birds. Box number 2 next to the pond has seen great tits raising families over recent years.
Birds and mammals often visit the ponds to drink, bathe, or even eat some of the contents.
Summer. By summer, the ponds are a riot of growth and activity. The small pond almost disappears below masses of self-seeded ragged robin and cotton grass.
Water lilies are only found in the small pond, whilst the big one is packed too with other plants such as water soldiers, bog bean, water forget-me-not and various aquatic grasses, sedges and rushes. Flowering purple loosestrife sways high over both ponds by late summer, attracting bees and other pollinators.
We let wildflowers such as Great Mullein, St John's wort and Rose Bay willow herb shoot up around the big pond. The pond is sheltered within. The small gap in front of the seat is perfect to give us a view of pond activity.
Wildflowers also carpet the area around and near our big pond. Self-heal is particularly successful in grass, which is mown only occasionally. Letting grass and wildflowers grow longer gives our insects, birds and small mammals a chance to shelter and feed.
Autumn. The ponds look very pretty in autumn when the leaves start to change, with reds, oranges and yellow foliage often more colourful than the green of summer. Of course the leaves do eventually fall, more of that later.
We don't cut down the plants around the ponds until the new year,
as they provide shelter for all kinds of bugs and seeds for feeding birds.
Winter. Ponds can be absolutely magical places in winter, especially if it snows or the surface freezes. The pond life has evolved to cope with cold conditions and is likely hibernating anyway, so we leave things be, especially as in Britain the cold snaps rarely last for long.
If any tree branches have snapped under the weight of snow, we remove them once wild weather has returned.
The joys of pond owning far outweigh the downsides, but we should perhaps mention a few issues which can occur.
Our plot is full of trees, these areas being no exception. Leaves fall in the water each autumn, building up in the ponds as they decay and possibly reducing the quality of the water.
We don't want to use netting because it looks horrible and can trap wildlife, and the rotting leaves provide hiding places for hibernating pond life, so we just take out a few floating leaves each year, mainly on the small pond, and otherwise let nature take its course.
The main pain for us is blanket weed. Some years are worse than others, depending on conditions and weather. We might have loads or hardly any. If it does creep up on us, we rake it out and leave it on the side for about 48 hours to allow any trapped creatures to escape.
This chore does provide the perfect opportunity for some pond dipping, however. How many pond creatures can you spot in this bucket?
Plants grow fast and clearing some of them out is an inevitable task each year. We usually do it in late summer when the water is warmer and always enjoy looking for pond life. Dragon and damsel flies are often darting about by now.
To be honest, we would never be without our ponds now. They are the backdrop to our outdoor lives, whether chopping wood, hanging out washing, gardening or sharing the space with human visitors.
Ponds create such beautiful environments for any garden. Whether small or large, you will always attract wildlife and have the opportunity to introduce different plants. These plants can be of benefit to insects, amphibians, mammals and birds, and gorgeous to look at too.
So it seems it is true what they say, build a pond and the wildlife will come. Thanks for watching and happy wildlife pond gardening all.